There is a gray putty that costs exactly $2. It permanently seals violently bursting home plumbing pipes in 5 minutes. It physically cures harder than industrial solid steel. No paying massive midnight emergency plumbing dispatch fees. No ripping your expensive drywall entirely to shreds. No waiting hours while your basement heavily floods with water. Just a cheap gray clay and your bare hands. Emergency plumbers charge $1,000 to cut and solder a leaking copper pipe. They tell you heavy chemical patches are dangerous and temporary. They are lying strictly to protect their massive emergency labor rates. This $2 epoxy violently bonds with wet copper and PVC at the molecular level. It withstands a staggering 900 pounds of internal water pressure. It takes exactly 5 minutes to permanently cure. It costs less than a single bottle of drinking water. Why did your local plumber aggressively mock this chemical clay? Because the emergency plumbing market generates $120 billion annually. They built their massive empires strictly on your midnight panic. When a frozen copper pipe violently bursts inside your walls at 2 a.m., you watch completely helpless as water aggressively destroys your hardwood floors. You frantically call the 24-hour emergency plumbing hotline. The dispatcher knows exactly how desperate and terrified you are. They charge you $300 just to park their branded truck in your driveway. They charge you $150 an hour to slowly cut away your drywall. They aggressively melt the broken pipe with a massive acetylene torch. They solder a tiny new piece of cheap copper into the gap. They hand you a staggering $1,200 invoice before the sun even rises. This is a mathematically perfect exploitation of absolute human panic. A $2 stick of clay that stops the flood instantly destroys their leverage. You absolutely cannot extort a homeowner who controls their own water pressure. Let me take you back to heavy military combat engineering. During intense mechanized warfare in the mid-20th century, massive diesel tanks and heavy transport trucks suffered violent engine block cracks. Enemy shrapnel violently pierced the heavy metal cooling and fuel lines. Military mechanics absolutely could not weld active fuel lines in a heavy firefight. They desperately needed a chemical patch that could instantly cure into solid steel. Industrial chemists developed a highly aggressive steel, reinforced epoxy resin. When soldiers violently kneaded the two chemical parts together in their hands, an intense exothermic reaction aggressively activated the compound. They shoved the soft hot clay directly into the violently leaking engine blocks. Within exactly 5 minutes, the clay cured into an impenetrable metal fortress. The tanks drove straight back into combat with absolutely zero leaks. The heavy epoxy that saved entire armored divisions costs pennies to mass produce. But the modern residential plumbing cartel actively buried this military chemistry. They aggressively chose the expensive blowtorch over the cheap chemical patch. Before we expose the exact chemical bonding process, listen closely. This plumbing survival secret is just a single defensive maneuver. The massive home service cartels are actively hiding hundreds of permanent fixes. This channel is strictly dedicated to dismantling every single extortion trap. We are currently uncovering the $4 liquid that permanently fixes failing refrigerators. We are releasing the absolute off grid winter heating blueprints soon. Hit the subscribe button right now to secure your financial survival. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an exposed secret. Do not let them keep you completely dependent and financially drained. But absolutely do not close this video right now. We are about to dismantle the $120 billion emergency plumbing cartel completely. What actually happens when you try to tape a leaking pipe? Desperate homeowners often reach for heavy black duct tape or rubber patches. They frantically wrap the expensive tape around the violently spraying copper. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of intense hydrostatic pressure. Your residential water main pushes exactly 80 psi of constant pressure. That is 80 pounds of violent force pushing against every square inch of the pipe. When you wrap standard rubber or adhesive tape around a microscopic crack, the massive water pressure simply forces its way underneath the sticky adhesive. The tape violently swells up like a balloon and aggressively explodes. The plumber walks into your basement and sees the shredded tape. He aggressively mocks your attempt to fix the pipe yourself. He confidently claims that only a professional heavy weld can hold the water back. He treats a massive physical pressure problem like an exclusive guild secret. So how does a $2 clay physically defeat 80 pounds of violent water pressure. Steel, reinforced epoxy putty is not an adhesive or a sticky tape. It is a highly aggressive two-part molecular cross-linking polymer. When you physically knead the gray core and the black shell together, you violently trigger a massive exothermic chemical reaction. The putty literally gets physically hot in your bare hands. When you aggressively smash this hot putty into the leaking pipe crack, the chemical polymer physically forces its way into the microscopic pores of the metal. It does not just sit on top of the copper like a piece of weak tape. It chemically links with the actual atomic structure of the pipe. Within exactly 5 minutes, the putty violently hardens into a dense metallic solid. It achieves a staggering tensile strength of 900 psi. That is 10 times stronger than your residential water pressure will ever reach. The water violently smashes against the internal patch and stops completely. This is not a temporary rubber band, hiding the active leak. This is a permanent structural reconstruction of the physical pipe wall. Why is this putty not aggressively recommended by local plumbers? Let us look precisely at the brutal economic reality of home repair. A plumbing franchise relies entirely on incredibly high emergency labor rates. They strictly need you to panic when you see spraying water. A professional midnight pipe soldering service costs $1,000 and requires cutting walls. This steel, reinforced epoxy putty costs $2 and takes 5 minutes. A branded emergency pipe clamp kit costs $50 and often fails under pressure. This chemical molecular bond costs $2 and lasts completely forever. You absolutely cannot build a massive fleet of branded vans on $2 putty. You cannot charge a massive emergency dispatch fee for smashing clay. If every homeowner in America kept a tube of epoxy under their sink, the massive emergency plumbing industry would lose billions in a single winter. They survive strictly because you do not understand exothermic chemistry. You are exactly funding their massive advertising campaigns. How do you physically armor your bursting pipes today? Here is the strict and unforgiving protocol to stop any massive leak. Go immediately to any large hardware or basic auto parts store. Look strictly for a plastic tube labeled as steel reinforced epoxy putty. You will often see it branded heavily under the name JB Weld. A massive solid tube of this chemical compound costs roughly $8. That equals roughly $2 for the exact heavy dose your pipe needs. When a pipe violently bursts, instantly shut off your main house water valve. You must temporarily stop the heavy flow of water to apply the patch. Violently dry the leaking copper or PVC pipe with a heavy towel. Use a piece of heavy sandpaper to aggressively rough up the area around the crack. The putty strictly requires a heavily scratched surface to bond properly. Cut exactly 1 inch off the heavy putty stick with a sharp knife. Violently knead the putty in your fingers until the color is entirely uniform gray. You will actually feel the chemical reaction getting incredibly hot. Aggressively smash the hot putty directly over the open pipe crack. Taper the edges smoothly around the entire circumference of the pipe. Stand back and wait exactly 5 minutes for the violent curing process. The soft gray clay will aggressively turn into rock, hard steel. Turn your main house water valve violently back on. The massive 80 psi water pressure will hit the patch and completely fail. You just saved yourself $1,000 using a piece of military-grade clay. This exothermic polymer is much more than a simple handyman trick. This is a glaring rejection of an engineered system of domestic panic. Every time a massive industry discovers a permanent chemical seal, they deliberately bury it deep in the absolute dark. They replace it with incredibly expensive and highly invasive manual labor. They train their dispatchers to weaponize your absolute fear of water damage. They rely entirely on your inherent fear of cutting metal pipes. They want you completely and utterly dependent on their heavy torches. Military engineers built chemical systems designed to survive active combat. The residential service cartel actively ignored that resilient chemistry on purpose. That vicious cycle of corporate extortion ends right here today. You now possess the exact chemical blueprint to armor your plumbing. Share this critical knowledge with every single homeowner you know. Send this to anyone facing a massive, frozen winter pipe. Take back absolute control of your own residential infrastructure. But this is only the 9th step in our massive investigation. There is another heavily guarded mechanical secret you need to see. A $4 liquid that violently flushes a dying refrigerator compressor back to life. The massive home appliance cartel prayed you never discovered this chemistry. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover it. Starve the massive corporate system that violently bleeds you dry. The next vault is officially open.